Thank you, Congresswoman. Dan from Sunnyside asks, what can you do to get our police to be reformed and return to being first responders?
Hmm. So I think it's a great question, and obviously this has been an issue that has been top of mind at um, throughout our community and in debates throughout our community. So one thing that I think is important to discern is that policing budgets, policing issues, by and large, for the most part, are um, are handled at the municipal and state level. So for those who are joining, if this is your first town hall, we've got city officials, like we have our city council, we have, which we will be selecting next month. We have our state assembly, and they draft all of our state laws. And then we have the federal level. And as your congresswoman, I operate on the federal level. For a lot of policing reform issues or any sort of budgetary issues, etc., the vast majority of those will be handled at the city level and at the state level. But there are some things that we can do and that I can do, and I'll share with you, that we can handle and advocate for on the federal level. So one of the things that we've been kind of discussing, as I mentioned, I introduced legislation on the Andrew Kearse um, denial, accountability for denying medical care. But I think we have to go beyond that. I think one of the things that we can do on a federal level, which we have joined and amplified on, is banning and really changing our laws around qualified immunity. And what qualified immunity essentially does is that it really grants a lot of this violence that happens in interactions with law enforcement. It allows officers, in many cases, even cases that in many communities seem very clear cut, has led to a complete lack of accountability, claiming the clause of qualified immunity. And so in policing legislation that's being debated in the House, such as the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, the repeal of qualified immunity has been an extremely important negotiating lever. And beyond the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which introduces things like chokehold bans, I think what's important about that is that it's while we are fine to support it, and even in legislation that we're supporting with respect to Andrew Kearse, these are all very small pieces of the situation, right? If you ban a chokehold, that doesn't necessarily stop all police violence, and a lot of times, many of these policing issues, for example, in the case of Eric Garner, chokeholds were banned on the city level, and it happened anyway. So a lot of what we need to do is address a lot of the root causes when it comes to not just policing, but then ultimately, I think what this conversation really is about is safety, community safety, and really our cohesion and again, that safety as a community. And so beyond just looking at community safety strictly from a policing lens, one of the things that I've also done is that we have community funding projects that we are requesting 10 for our district, and we'll provide an update on that perhaps at next town hall or the town hall after. And one of the community funding projects that we have requested has been for a really remarkable program that's being run right out of our district at Jacobi Hospital, and it's called the Stand Up to Violence Program. Now, one thing that we are seeing is that what the Stand Up to Violence program does is that it started off almost as an experiment at Jacobi Hospital for individuals who are admitted due to being victimized in incidents of violence, whether it's gang violence, domestic violence, etc. And so if you come in admitted with a gunshot wound or a stabbing wound, for example, they bring in not just your medical first response, but your social first response. And so psychiatrists are brought in, social workers are brought in, And the actual lead up to the violent incident is discovered and explored instead of not from a jail, but from the hospital. And what that means is that we bring in a social worker. They'll say what led to this incident. We assess the person's employment situation, their housing situation, as well as bringing in a psychological first response. And who's one of whose main goals is to help the person navigate what is obviously and clearly a traumatizing experience. And a main preventer in developing PTSD is having that early intervention, but also reducing the desire for retribution. And one of the things that we have found that the folks at Jacobi Medical Center have discovered is that when you take a public health approach to incidents of violence, they were able to reduce readmission. They were able to reduce the reoccurrence of violence that leads that person to go to the hospital by 59%. 59%. That's immediate. And so when we talk about this larger issue about, public safety is not just about how much money you pump into jails and policing, but public safety is how do you prevent a kid from getting in trouble in the first place? It's about funding schools enough and treating them in a way that they don't constitute a school to prison pipeline. It's about making sure that people are housed in a community, that they're gainfully employed in a community, particularly young people, that we start to see those reductions in crime. And so I just say all of this to encourage us to encourage the conversation about safety to actually go beyond just a conversation solely about policing. But this is about making sure that communities are invested in and safe and prosperous in the first place, which can really help prevent a lot of violent behavior. And we've seen this. And so I'm extraordinarily proud of our social workers and our doctors and our public health workers at Jacobi Hospital, because this is truly groundbreaking stuff, groundbreaking work. And that is one of the main reasons why we have selected the Stand Up to Violence program as one of our community investment projects to get more investment in expanding this program and resources. And hopefully right here in the Bronx can be the beginning and really a big part of a much larger change across the country in how we approach questions of public safety and policy around public safety.
Thank you, Congresswoman. The next question is from Katie from the New York Times.
Hi, Congresswoman. Thank you for taking my question. So you talked tonight about the importance of thinking about public safety in comprehensive terms beyond matters of policing. And I promise that this isn't actually a question about the mayor's race, but I will note that we have seen in the mayor's race so far a lot of polling that suggests that crime is a top issue for Democratic voters right now. The current two leading candidates talk often about proposals like adding more police to the subways. And I just wonder if you worry about the mood of the party in New York on this issue and what you're seeing on the ground on this issue in your district.
Yeah, I think, again, the thing that's really important is that, of course, we should all be concerned and all really examine some of the root causes of violence. And it's really important that we address it. Now, what I think is really important is that we use very strong evidence-based approaches to addressing and dismantling and bringing down the incidence of violence in communities. And by evidence-based, I don't just mean correlative, and I don't just mean trends. I mean investing in solutions that have been clinically shown to reduce incidence of crime. And so while I think it's really important that we talk about this issue, I think that we have to end this reflexive or rather this very impulsive reflex of just saying, where there's crime, add police, don't really have any other plan beyond that, and make a wish that that's going to change things. We know that that doesn't work. And so if the knee-jerk reaction to every time someone sees an elevated incidence of crime is to just pour money into policing, I really question how much that person has really thoroughly looked at the data and thought about this issue and how comprehensive their response is. Because if the only element that a person discusses when it comes to public safety is police, I think that their scope is woefully narrow in solving this issue. As I mentioned, here at Jacobi, and along with many other issues, like, for example, addressing housing instability, is an extremely effective approach. Again, looking at things like stand up to violence, we see that when we address root causes of violence, when you actually dig into what precipitated the incident, when you examine housing, employment status, and when you bring in actual psychological care, we see dramatic reductions in recidivism and in repeat levels of crime and offenses. And one thing that I think is really important is that we see, as these COVID restrictions get lifted, we are seeing certain upticks in violent crime, shootings, etc. That's, if anything, it only adds to the urgency for people to stop looking at this from a knee-jerk, if everything, if you have a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And if elected officials are only looking at public safety through the lens of policing, they are not going to make their community safer. I mean, that's just the fact. There was this resistance to the idea of having mental health first responders when a huge percentage of individuals who are incarcerated are shown to have issues with mental health. I mean, housing and mental health are huge aspects, and lack of health care, etc. I mean, if we don't have first responders that are capable of addressing the actual drivers of the instability that contribute to violence, I mean, I don't see how a leader can navigate a city to safety if the only tool or the first tool that they reach for is policing, and they aren't doing anything to really dramatically shift housing, employment, mental health care, overall health care, etc.
Great, thank you. And that is all the questions from the press.